Bueno, buenos días a todos. Para el Guatemala Green Building Council ha sido un honor compartir todos estos días con ustedes. Muchas gracias por habernos acompañado. Queremos agradecer de todo nuestro corazón a los patrocinadores y a nuestros aliados en este evento, con quienes sin duda este evento no hubiera sido posible. Mi nombre es Katia Ardón y los voy a estar acompañando el día de hoy. Para el Guatemala Green Building Council es de mucho agrado, de mucha felicidad y de mucho honor poder tener este espacio hoy aquí con ustedes, donde tendremos la oportunidad de conocer de la mano de Foster & Partners sobre sus estrategias de sostenibilidad. El día de hoy vamos a contar con Christopher Trott y con Juan Bautista Frigerio de la empresa Foster & Partners. Ellos son dos aliados y participantes clave en esta firma, por lo que nos complace mucho poder contar con ellos el día de hoy. Para contarles un poco, Chris es originario de Cardiff, Inglaterra, es el gerente de sostenibilidad de Foster & Partners. La unirse a Foster & Partners le permitió compartir su aprendizaje en ingeniería civil y servicios medioambientales con su pasión el integrar la sostenibilidad con el diseño altamente integrado. Chris es un cristiano activo y tiene un interés particular en integrar todas las creencias para que juntas trabajen unidas para beneficiar la vida humana y el entorno natural. Luego tenemos a Juan. Juan es un arquitecto, partner de Foster & Partners, y él está basado en América Latina. Juan ha liderado negocios pioneros para la firma, asegurando el trabajo en Brasil, Argentina, Chile y Colombia. Fue el líder del proyecto del Palacio Municipal de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, el cual tras su construcción se ha convertido en un icono arquitectónico en la ciudad. Juan se unió a Foster & Partners en el año 2000, tras graduarse de la Escuela de Diseño de Harvard. Es uno de las piezas claves de Foster & Partners y uno de sus trabajos más emblemáticos fue el estadio Wembley en Londres. Muchas gracias a ambos por acompañarnos el día de hoy. A partir de este punto, la conferencia se va a estar llevando en inglés, por lo que si alguien necesita interpretación simultánea, puede acceder a la misma por medio de un link que vamos a colgar en el área de chat que está en el lado derecho de sus pantallas. Si alguien tuviera alguna duda o pregunta que quisiera hacerle saber a nuestros conferencistas, lo puede hacer saber también en esta parte de la pantalla. Así que, nada, pues, welcome Chris and Juan. If you can tell me if you can hear me now.
I can hear you. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay.
Thank you, Katia, for the introduction. Yes, I can hear you both, and I can see you as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you to both of you so much for being with us here today. It's a great pleasure, it's a great honor. And yeah, the floor is yours. Take us
Thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. So Juan and I are both going to present to you, as Katia has said. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the kind words, Katia. And it's really a great pleasure for us to be here with you today after your 3 busy days. And I hope we'll help to finish your conference off before you depart this evening. You might have noticed from the photograph of Juan and I that we were doing our best in that photograph to be socially distanced. I think by about 6,000 or 7,000 miles, if I'm right. So I will just carry on with this now. So we've entitled our talk to Building Our Future, and we feel very passionately about that subject. For those of you that may not know the practice, we're a global practice, and we work designing buildings, products, and also making places for communities throughout the world. not least of which in the Americas. We've done a lot of work in the Americas. Juan will speak about some of the amazing projects he's involved in Southern America shortly. Some of the American projects that we've done recently would include here the Apple campus in Cupertino, Spaceport here, and we have a variety of live projects, some of which I will show you now in a minute. I mean, the practice has been around now for over 50 years, and during that period of time, sustainability has always been part of the DNA of the practice. It's been a core principle of what we've done. From the early days in the late 60s, when we were thinking intuitively about sustainability, trying to figure out what it meant, and then into the 80s, when maybe quantification systems arrived, such as LEED, which you use quite extensively, and then more recently with what I would call holistic sustainability. And during that period of time, the agenda has become broader and broader. It's informed all of our projects during that period of time, as we've understood more and more of the science, I suppose, and the scientific background of sustainability. But also the agenda has changed from an energy efficiency and a green agenda to something which is much broader than that. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they're a great set of goals, but of course they're very general because they're aimed at nations. So we have a slightly more specific set of key indicators, which we call our responsibility framework, which I'll talk through some of with you in a minute. But they really help to tell an architectural practice what to do when it goes to work on a Monday morning. And that includes things like well-being, community impact, energy and carbon, mobility and connectivity, resource use, water, land and ecology, but also social equity, the planning for change, and feedback. I'll give you a brief example of how they get used. So this is our Masdar development in Abu Dhabi, where although all of those things were important, those 10 things, the really big themes very quickly became energy and carbon, because we powered the whole development by renewable energy. We had off-site provision for cars. No cars were allowed on site for mobility, and we thought very hard about water and the management of water and the reduction of water. So that's a way that we often kind of look at these things. A little closer to home. So this is the Apple campus, opened about 2 years ago now, and a huge issue on that for us was land and ecology, was to actually make a set of buildings that were very much in a park, thinking very carefully about health and well-being aspects for all of the employees and visitors, and also thinking about energy and carbon, because the development was a net zero energy development. So the rules started to change in 2015 again with the publishing of the Paris Agreement, and all of the implications around that. And the first thing we did was to understand it and to write this document together with the United Nations, which was a visual interpretation of it to explain the various parts of the Paris Agreement. And I'll talk very briefly to some of those now. So many of you will have heard that the agreement was trying to stop climate change, lifting the average global temperature to more than 2 degrees, and with a longer term goal of 1.5 degrees, which has now been confirmed. That is the goal that everybody is aiming for, is 1.5 degrees centigrade. Not so well known, but within that was also the need to balance carbon and other emissions with sinks to absorb them, so to bring the world into a balance between atmospheric emissions and the sinks to absorb it. As we work throughout the world, we work in many sustainability rating systems all over the world, and of course in the United States often that would be LEED and its derivatives, and sometimes things like the Living Building Challenge. One of the things that we've realized as we've looked at those, and we've done some analysis of different buildings in different areas, including our own buildings, is that the existing rating systems don't go far enough to meet the Paris Agreement. Even the best of the scores in most of the rating systems tend to imply something in the region of a 3 degrees temperature trajectory into the future. So how do we bridge the gap? What do we do so as we don't go above 1.5 degrees? And that's something we thought very carefully about. It's meant that we've had to understand a lot more than we did previously about atmospheric emissions. And in one way or another, the built environment, and that is buildings, industry, and transport systems, are responsible for about 64% of all atmospheric emissions. So we are significantly responsible for climate change. The other sectors tend to be predominated by land uses such as agriculture and forestry. So what we've understood is we really have to know where carbon is coming from associated with our buildings, because it goes into the atmosphere. But we also have to understand how we're using the land mass, which is ecological footprint is the way that we choose to do that, because the two have to be in balance. And put simply, if the Earth is above one planet of ecological footprint, then carbon can't be taken out of the atmosphere and it causes climate change. So we published, and this is on our website for anybody who's interested to look at it, about a year ago, our manifesto, which is our approach to working with clients to offer to design buildings in accordance with the Paris Agreement for them. And we look at these particular areas of a project. We look at how the project is set up, such as the designers and how the site is formed in the first place. We look at the carbon that goes into the structure. We look at the carbon that goes into the facades. We look at the carbon that goes into the building services. We look at the carbon that goes into fit out and operations. And largely, that is what we would call embodied carbon. Then we look at operational energy. We look at the energy used in transport systems running to and from the buildings. And you can see from a typical central business district distribution that there is quite a difference between where the carbon is in each of those. And understanding that is key to good design. And I'll run through some examples now. The methodology that we've developed is it doesn't matter what scale, where the building is, it's entirely non-specific to building typology or scale, and we are running it on all of our projects. And as you can see, there's a great variety of them shown here. So I run through a little example, which is a live project. It's an office tower. And I'll run through each of those steps so you can see how we think about it. So I'm taking as an example the structure, and you can see up here 0.7, and that means that we've identified 0.7 tons of carbon dioxide per square meter of the development going into the atmosphere over the whole life of the building. That's a 60-year life span. And then we measure where it is. So we've looked at where it is in the walls and the frames and the columns and the floors and the foundations. And for a tall building, unsurprisingly, most of the carbon is in the steel, which is the horizontal load-bearing steel, stopping the building falling over. So that's an example of a distribution which we can use with our designs. We do each and every part of the building through from the preliminaries to set the building up, the structure, the facade, the services, the fitting out, the energy, and the transport. And I'll just point out to you that the fit out is often the largest component of carbon within a building over its lifetime. And that's because fit out gets replaced quite regularly. Transport also is a big number, and this is a well-placed transport orientated development. So this number here could easily be more than the rest of the building put together. So we have to think very carefully about transport around this. But once we've done all of the best things that we can, we still have about 6.4 tons of carbon available or left. So what does that mean we have to do? So what we do then is work with our clients to find out how to offset that carbon to bring the building into a climate neutral situation in regard to its carbon offsets. The other thing we think is increasingly necessary is the way that people work together. At the moment, there's a very linear process for all of those involved in projects, from those that finance it through the clients and the design processes to procurement and offsets, everybody doing it slightly differently. And we think actually we have to get very quickly to a situation where all of that is a circular process, everybody playing by the same rules. So if we do all of that, where we find ourselves is in a situation where we work really hard to bring atmospheric emissions down from our building over its lifetime, and we do our absolute best to improve the absorption of any emissions that there is and offset the emissions. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that in the future one might expect the built-in environment to be much more green. It will be much more healthy, and there will be, and which affects well-being and the pleasure that we get out of it. Not that this amount of green will absorb all of the emissions from this, but nevertheless, we will see more and more of it penetrating into buildings in the future. Now, Juan will talk in a minute about a couple of his projects. One of them is this one, which is in Buenos Aires, Avenue Cordoba. And this is just to explain that when we looked at the structure very carefully, various forms of structure, we found a way of reducing the carbon from the structure by 50% by being clever about the way that the load traveled to the foundation. And we looked very carefully also at all of the shading systems associated with the building, because we have found it's normally very good to have shading on a building to reduce the energy. But if the shading is too heavy, you can actually put back more carbon over the lifetime of a building that you can take away. So you have to make sure you do it properly. And Juan will talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to now pass on to Juan, who will talk about these two great projects that he's been working on for the last several years. And hopefully at the end, I'll come back for a couple of minutes before the questions and answers. So I'll hand over, if I may, now to Juan.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Katia, and thank you, Guatemala Green Building Council. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, Juan, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you once again for the invitation, and thank you, Chris, for introducing the talk. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to present to you these two projects and to present jointly with Chris Trott, who is one of our brilliant engineers at Foster, who's pushing our sustainability agenda forward. I'm speaking to you from Buenos Aires right now, where I'm based, where I'm heading our branch here, which oversees and develops our projects in South America. And I'm going to start showing you the project in Buenos Aires that Chris mentioned, Avenida Córdoba 120, and then another project in Santiago de Chile. And I'm very happy to say that this is the first time that we present these projects publicly. They are projects which are currently on our drawing board. We've publicly announced the Buenos Aires project only last week, and our client for the Santiago project, Grupo Patio, has kindly allowed us to present this project to you, even though we haven't yet publicly announced it and we're still working on it. So the first project, of course, is Buenos Aires. This is the Avenida 9 de Julio, the center of our building. And this is the third project we do in the city. The first one, the Aleph, is a residential project. The second, City Hall, which is here shown on the screen, is one of the first civic buildings which we certified LEED Gold in Buenos Aires, and which was preceded by the Aleph, a residential building, which of course had many sustainable themes as well for housing, as shading the facade and adapting the buildings to climate. What's very particular about this new project, which is an office building, it's a commercial office building, is located at the edge of the city, right on the waterfront. So it has fantastic views. And just to show you a bit of how we work, this is a model we made in our model shop of a large area of the city to study the massing of the building and how to best build a large tower onto this site. It's a historic site. There you see at the center of the image, Puerto Madero, the Costanera Sur as well, which was a public area back in the 30s, and our site there in the red box, in which is a very historic fabric. And it's very central, as I was saying. It's very well served by public transport, and you know, it's a very prominent location. So we thought it was a very special area to develop carefully the building there. This is viewing back to the site. The blue tower is our next door neighbor, so we'll be nestling our building in between here. There you see in the foreground the docks of Puerto Madero. And closer to our site, from the city side where all the transport hub is, and currently where we are, we've already excavated the site and we're starting to build the foundations shortly for the towers and the basements. So we gave a lot of thought on how to develop the massing. Usually we work with many iterations of building. So we started looking at a central core tower, then pushing the core towards the back to create more views, shifting it, opening up the floor plate and looking for the right massing. And then we realized that because we have such a large bulky neighbor towards our north, and we can use that neighbor to shape part of the building, but if we shape the building in a triangular form, we could get the best of the performance of the building and the views. This again is working with our team in London. We like working with very large models, all sorts of models, and all sorts of tools to understand better how the building and the shape performs. And from this view study is what created basically the shape, thinking of views as a fluid and actually flooding the site with views and seeing where the view wanted to go. So in these diagrams, you see that the shape of the building will generally follow the pink splash of views. And then in the model I showed you before, the form of the building, how it settles in, how the triangular shape maximizes the long view corridors towards the water and towards the city at the back. And from Puerto Madero, the Córdoba Avenue is almost on the axis of our site. So this gave us a very prominent tower. One of the very fortunate things we were able to do is that we were granted an incentive by the city that if we freed up 70% of the land and created it as public land, we could get a higher tower. So we found the opportunity to make a fantastic urban garden and celebrate as well some of the aspects of the city. Buenos Aires is a very social city, lots of nightlife, lots of passion for tango, and lots of social interaction, which is limited a bit now by the COVID, but which we hope to recover very soon. And to create this amazing lush garden, most of the civic piazzas that we've inherited from modernism are very dry landscapes. And on the contrary to that, what we wanted was to create a jungle, a very dense forest, to harbor what Chris was discussing before of actually sequestering and absorbing part of the carbon with a very dense canopy of trees and very lawn areas, and to even raise the building above the ground so that the landscape even could continue below the building. And to have all this collection of our native species of Buenos Aires, the jacaranda tree, which is a beautiful tree, which is about to blossom now in November with its lilac flowers, the ceibo, which is pink flowers, and palm trees, which grow also very naturally in Buenos Aires, to create a very dense, lush forest, and a fantastic experience that as you approach the building, you actually walk through this very beautiful jungle. This is the cafe at the bottom, creating this very contained space surrounded by architecture, by the trees, for a more private space that goes under the building, but allows people to cross from one side of the other of the city. And then the idea that you would go up through these escalators in the forest and continue your gardens up through the tower. So as you arrive to your lobby, instead of having the lobby on the ground floor, you actually come through escalators, you come through a promenade of steps and gardens to this elevated lobby, from which then you can look back to the city and the gardens, and actually finding spaces to be social, to have a coffee in the morning before you work, and create a very relaxed, contemporary workplace that also would blur down the boundaries of the domestic and the corporate. This is the lobby. It's quite compact, but with the extension of the terraces and having linear gardens on the terraces that then have also vegetation that cascades over the edge of the building, and developing this very natural palette of materials with wood, with leather, with paving stones, and with reinforced expressed concrete to create a very biophilic building which celebrates nature. This is the view from the lobby looking out, and the idea is that you're in an oasis of green surrounded, and all the noise that you have from the city, which is quite noisy, gets buffered as well to create this very unique, elegant, and fantastic experience for building. As we go up the section, another of the ideas was that we wanted to really have social spaces, and instead of having a single-floored small floor plates, creating these large atriums which go up the building, and a series of villages, which then we could also introduce nature within these courtyards. So we have 5 of these villages around the building, which is unprecedented for a commercial building. And there, we have to congratulate our clients, which were also very forward thinking and accompanied us in this journey of creating one of the most forward-thinking office buildings, not only in Argentina, but we think of the world. And as we developed this idea of having the green and terraces go up through the building so that we could green the whole building, then we found a lot of structural challenges on how to make the most efficient structure. So these are a number of different structural studies, how we could balance the amount of material and the structural performance to create these gardens. And, after a number of studies and of the weight of the building and the structure, and we found this solution, which with inclined concrete struts, we could create these very large openings in garden, but still have a very efficient structure to create these amazing gardens. So these are spaces which we conceive as not only spaces to work, but spaces to socialize. This is sort of our holistic view of how you see the workplace, which goes into the well-being and the philosophy of the WELL certification, that as you're working, you're surrounded by gardens on many of the levels of the building. And then these spaces are designed not only for work, for meetings, for relaxation, but also to have yoga classes, to have forums, to have teachings. So this outdoor space becomes more important even than the indoor space. And here is one of our early images of how you would feel within this canopy of trees. We did also a number of wind tunnel studies, which were conducted in Australia, to verify that we had acceptable levels of comfort on the wind, because Buenos Aires is quite a windy city as you go up. And then to have this image of the building where you have the gardens cascading down on each side of the triangular face of the building. So some of them face the city, some of them face the river, and as we segment the building, we also start integrating it with the different heights of the fabric of Buenos Aires. These studies, as Chris was mentioning before, we were very conscious. Buenos Aires can get very hot. The sun is very aggressive, particularly in the west and in the summer. So we started with a baseline scenario. If we had 70% glass, what the operational carbon of the building would be. And then we started doing a number of iterations. Well, what happens when you start shading the glass? And of course, you reduce your operational carbon. And as you start adding different shading systems and different materials, if we did them in timber, if we did them in ceramics and glass, trying to find which of the materials actually would be the most efficient in terms of reducing this carbon liberation into the atmosphere. So we did a number of these, and as we did this, of course, we learned, as Chris mentioned, that we had to balance, adding cladding material, adding aluminium, adding other materials, which helped us to reduce the sun on the facade, but added some more in terms of materials and more weight onto the building. So after doing a number of these studies, we learned that we had to find sort of an optimum balance in between the amount of glass and the amount of shading and the amount of material, which was quite an enriching process for myself and for the team. And also always bearing in mind our sensibility to the aesthetic. So even though in this option we had very much shading and we reduced a 6.1% on the basis, the amount of material that we had to add for that almost offset part of the gains that we had. So we ended up with 3 options, 3 studies which we presented to our clients. We costed them, we reduced that to 2, and the logic of this facade, of course, was if we can get the largest piece of glass available, commercially available, and the rest of the facade, we actually make blank pieces of facade, then we had a huge gain in terms of reducing the glazed area of the building. So our average solar radiation reduced a lot, and of course our solar radiation reduced a lot. So instead of having a curtain wall building, we found that, you know, even though the views were very valuable, we could still have amazing views with less glass. And if we folded the metal actually to provide a lot of the shading at the high point of the sun, then we had the optimal solution in terms of carbon reduction and footprint reduction and views. So this is the solution that we currently have, which is a picture frame, which is saying if we move away from curtain wall buildings and we look at the surroundings where traditional buildings had less glass, but still we have amazing frame views, we have huge daylight penetration, but we can reduce part of the effect of the weather by shading part of the facade. So to finish, this is the building as it looks now from the south. And then an evening image from Puerto Madero, where we have this very textured facade with the picture frames and the large terraces, these large voids, which then we could green up and also add to the absorption that we're looking to achieve through vegetation. I'm going to fly now to Chile, to La Fábrica. This is a project that we started about 9 months ago. It's our first project in Chile. Santiago is also a city that is evolving. It's in a number of development patterns on the basis of the automobile. And this is what names our project, La Fábrica, with actually it's a factory. It's in a very industrial neighborhood, San Joaquin. And this was a building built in the 1940s, which was the main manufacturer of silk and cotton in Chile. So it was a very important factory. And it has a very rich social history and political history, because at one point it was actually taken by the workers, then it was reclaimed. But there was always a vision from the owners to provide, you know, a center for social. They provided housing for the workers. They provided school, nursery. So it was a very forward-thinking place. And it created, along the site, all the housing was workers' housing, to which a lot of the families of the original workers of the factory still live. So a very beautiful project in terms of the architecture, but in terms of also of the social history and the social implications that it has. So our commission was to do a master plan for the site A, that's shown there in red, and to do 600 units of housing associated to the factory in the site B. So if we look at it in the context of Santiago, the site is there at the center of the city, is the pink dot, and it was on the axis of these green corridors, which are part of the new planning of Santiago to try to make the city more green. So we had a number of conversations with the city hall, with neighborhood organizations, and this is as the site currently sits. You see, it's a very barren site. So the green corridor would cross along here, where you see that green football field. And I ask you to look here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but towards the right and center, you see a blue swimming pool and 2 large towers. This is the pattern of development and housing that has become predominant in Santiago. And you see it here in the background of the image again, these very tall towers with reach the ground. And one of the missions that we put onto ourselves is that we wanted to change this pattern of development. We do not want to build tall. We do not want to build far away from the ground. And we asked our client to follow us in having lower buildings. Buildings would create green spaces, and which have a more dense urbanism. This is the Fábrica now. You can see it has these large spaces surrounding it. In the front, which are surface parking lots, and currently it's a retail outlet. Part of our brief was to enhance this retail. And again, from another angle, you see the future development, how the planning only considers very tall buildings with a very poor relationship to the ground. So our first recommendation, we love the existing building. It was a very avant-garde deep plan building, 200 meters deep by 200 wide. The concrete shells, which are from the 1940s, were a very forward-thinking technology at the time. And of course, this profile was related to bringing natural daylight. So we would even say that this building was a sustainable building, even in its conception. So we discussed very strongly that the building had to be kept, and that of course there's a value in keeping buildings. Instead of demolishing, we also save carbon by refunctionalizing and improving existing structures and not actually demolishing. Whereas the models of development I was showing you before, the model is to demolishing all of the existing and create new buildings. But again, the social fabric, keeping the memory of the buildings, keeping the livelihood of the neighborhood, avoiding gentrification. These are the workers' housing on the perimeter. Is sort of very sensible socially. People with their gardens, their relationships to the floor, their small commerces, which they put on the front porches. So we wanted to celebrate that, to enhance it. We wanted people to remain on the side. And how could you do an architecture that was sympathetic to this feeling, that would make people love their neighborhoods and not want to leave? So as I go now to site B, and this is how we developed the master plan, we decided to split into smaller blocks, the large block, and to have low buildings in terms of 6th floor, to densify all of the edges of the building with housing and offices, creating a mixed-use district, creating a south boulevard, removing only the bits of the factory which were not from the original building to create space, densifying the back to create a destination, and densifying the edges, always very exciting, food and beverages, retail, housing and offices. And then to actually create access, reconnecting all of the existing neighborhood, the new housing, and the back where you would have, again, more housing. And actually, by only removing a center of the factory, to actually create a wonderful access, keeping at the center the clock tower, which is an original clock tower, which is a marker that identifies the place, bring it into the design, and then moving through to the South Boulevard, where you have this very vibrant mixed-use district with residential, entertainment, and becomes an enrichment, a destination for the new residents, but also to the existing residents, and to try to push forward this vision of a green city. I'm going to quickly pass through then site B, our ideas for the residences. This, of course, is on the drawing board, is work in progress. And again, we conceive the city as the social spaces of the city. So we split in 4 blocks with what we call the North Boulevard with retail, the residential streets. This is our North Boulevard. We come to our central piazza, which is a very civic space. Even though it's private land, it will be offered to the public as a public accessible street. The development of the blocks had at the heart courtyards, green courtyards again, to add more vegetation, to absorb more carbon with our trees. And these very beautiful rich courtyards, which, as in our previous project, we're always trying to have as much dense vegetation as we can. The units are very small units. They're for middle class, low income families, young families, new families. So there's also a social agenda to embrace all sorts of new families, not traditional families, but a very compact space with very good quality spaces, good daylighting, and an access which resolves the service at the back and the kitchens and all the wet spaces. And then the ground floor is very important for us. And this, we see a tapestry of small retail, not the only very few opportunities for big retail, but to keep the livelihood of the neighborhood with a small retail. And then just to finish, we're again trying a very ambitious idea, which is to celebrate wood. Steel, we say, is the 19th century material, concrete, the 20th century material. But if we can make wood the predominant material of the 21st century, wood is a storehouse for carbon. And Chile, we saw an opportunity. 25% of Chile, especially the south, is covered with wood. Lots of it is naturally regenerated, but there's very global players in terms of the wood market. And Chile is a very forward-thinking country, a very avant-garde mentality. And we thought there's an opportunity to celebrate also a tradition in wood. These are the churches of the south of Chile. Not only is the cladding made in wood, but the whole buildings are entirely built in wood. The floors, the furniture, the ceilings, the structure. We went and we visited some of the CLT plants, and we thought, well, we have a real opportunity to do an impact in carbon life by looking at a structure in wood and actually promoting a new pattern of development, but also a new pattern of construction, so that maybe we can do, help push forward the agenda in making mass timber buildings the mainstream of construction. We kept the buildings low for that. We analyzed the full scope of carbon on the project, from the preliminaries to the structure, the facades, analyzing every aspect of it. And these are some initial studies of different options of how we've moved into the framework of the Paris Agreement. This is, of course, some excellent work that Chris did with his team in London and my team in London and Buenos Aires. So if we look at the Paris Agreement targets, this option 1, which is one of our timber options, we're a bit above the 2-degree target, but if we actually use recycled steel and we're promoting using low carbon concrete, which is especially in the cores, we could be somewhere between the 1.5 and 2-degree carbon. We did a number of iterations. We might need to have a concrete plinth for a number of technical reasons, but still, if we do some operations in terms of how we use recycled steel and low carbon concrete, we would achieve our target of being below the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement. And in this slide, we compare if we did the whole building in concrete, whereas doing our option 1, which is mass timber, you see how much impact it has. Less than 20% reduction in the carbon by using a mass timber building. And another important thing that of course Chris Trott always remind me, a lot of the embodied carbon is below ground. So if we move towards a move with less vehicles, less parking underground, and less basement, less removal of earth, of course, we reduce a lot of the embodied carbon by reducing the footprint of buildings below the ground. And of course, looking at if we use GGBS, cement replacement, reusable formwork, basically all the tricks we can find, recycled content, low carbon sourcings by using power from solars. We analyze with Chris's teams all of these opportunities and we try to promote them. So this is the structure as it stands now, a very tight grid. So we have to optimize the cross-laminated timber floor straps, a grid of columns at 2.2 by 4.4 with concealed connections, which are then protected by the wood. And what are the spatial implications? Again, working with models is what we like to do. And, an option, the most effective option, having, a mass timber structure with no beams for service transferences. The facade as it looks now, and then again, it's an ongoing discussion of how you deal in fire with buildings. Of course, in a mass timber building is a sensitive analysis. And we're working with fire engineers, both our internal engineers at Foster's, but our Chilean counterparts in Chile, to try to deliver this vision where we can provide a safe and beautiful building, a sustainable building in mass timber. Ideally, we will have this unencapsulated, leaving the timber exposed, or we might find that partially we have to encapsulate it, or even if we need to fully encapsulate it, it would still be a very sustainable building because we're moving away from building in reinforced concrete. So to finish, the vision, Santiago, the Andes, the Cordillera de la Costa, and the sunset, we want to create this very vibrant, sustainable community for a very vibrant future. I'm going to hand over back to Chris so he finishes the presentation, and thank you once again for your time and for inviting us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Juan. So I think you'll have seen some science from myself at the beginning, and you've seen a lot of discussion of the way that the architectural teams have an attitude to the social aspects of the buildings, creating marvelous places for health and well-being, and also work very closely with us around the science. So a little movie, just for a minute or so, which will, I think, give you an understanding of how these things come together in practice. So if I just share to you now, and hopefully what you will now see is one of our North American projects, again, where we're looking at a balance between embodied carbon, operational carbon, and thinking carefully about ecological footprint to make sure that all of those things are in balance. So this is a project where we're doing both the master plan and we're doing a lot of individual buildings in the Bay Area. And this is looking at some of the technology where we set carbon standards for the building as we first conceptualize the building in comparison to benchmarks, and we try and do our best to reduce against the benchmarks. And then using BIM technology, we're able to quantify the material quantities in the buildings, and we're able to, with our algorithms, check the amount of embodied carbon, operational carbon, and also the ecological footprint of the buildings to make sure that we can bring ourselves back into balance with what the Earth can handle. Then within that, what we're now developing is palettes of materials. So as we make the design selections, whether they're columns or whether they're the frames for the curtain walling or the curtain walling panels themselves, we can work very rapidly with our architects and our engineers, perhaps just selecting floor slabs, and we can see, and here are the shading devices similar to those that have been talked about by Juan. So together with the structural framing, we can add all of the carbon impact together to inform the design at each step. And we genuinely do now believe that design that reverses climate change is possible, and our aim is to design projects that are climate restorative. So thanks very much for listening to us, and I think we're now over to potentially some questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much to the both of you. Very interesting and inspiring. So we have a few questions from our audience. The first one says, what is the relation between the cost of this type of architecture versus traditional construction?
Well, do you want to answer that one, or shall I?
Yes, I'll answer. This is a question that frequently comes up, and it's not an answer that's fixed in time. It's varying because as sustainable construction is becoming mainstream, the capital investment for a sustainable building is less and less. The other thing that to bear in mind is that usually the operational cost over the life cycle of the building is significantly less when you have sustainable buildings than non-sustainable buildings. So even though you might have a initial capital which might raise your cost of your building between 10 and 20%, over the life cycle of the building, that could be a huge saving. So we hugely defend the intelligence of investing in sustainable buildings. Additionally, there's of course a huge market. All the mainstream clients, all our major clients for the last 5 to 10 years, some of them are pushing us even harder to have sustainable buildings, because nobody wants to be anymore in a building that doesn't send the message that it's doing the right thing for our planet and for our children. And actually what we're finding now post-COVID is that there's even more pressure from clients, from tenants, to have natural ventilation in buildings, air renovation in buildings, outdoor spaces in buildings. So in a way, if we can take something positive out of COVID, is that we think it will help push the agenda of sustainability.
And if I might just add to that, one of the things we've understood the more we've looked at embodied carbon is if you drive embodied carbon down in a building by making sensible decisions, sensible design decisions, you're normally driving materials out of the building. So often you can save money by having less carbon embodied in the building than you might have had. So in a way, carbon and money go together quite well when it comes to embodied carbon.
Yes, and to add to that, usually we say that there's three major ways to look at it. One is having an active system, which is sort of photovoltaics, or having groundwater reuse. Then you have passive systems, which have to do with maybe having chilled beams and those ceilings. But then there's a third component, which is the shape of the building, which is something that is almost free, and which has to be the way that intelligent buildings have been done all over time, which is if you do a building which is sensitive to your climate, which is shaded, which lets in natural light, which protects from the rain, from the sun. Just with building fabric, you can get a sustainable building by having good form. That actually is already part of your initial cost. So you can go a long way just by design intelligence and sustainability without having to add active systems or power.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to ask you a question regarding the implementation of strategies for reducing the carbon emissions. How do you kind of convince your client to apply this strategy? You know, because sometimes they say like, no, that's not important, or something along those lines. How do you make them see the importance of implementing all these strategies?
Well, one of the things that I think I would say is in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been quite a sea change in, I think, both social attitude and client attitude towards carbon emissions and to the damage that is being done by the environment. So what we're finding is when we bring this subject up to discuss it with clients, they're much more willing to listen than they were perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, because you know, the people who are going to occupy these buildings, whether they're residential or they're commercial buildings, now understand a lot more about the issues around climate change. They understand much more about health and well-being issues. They're quite happy to invest in their own health. And I think one of the things that you will have seen from the architecture that Juan has shown you is if we look very carefully at the elements of a building that make it healthy and make it very natural to be in, then you have the ability then to make low carbon buildings at the same time. So I think what I'm saying is if you bring the two things together, healthy buildings can be low carbon buildings, and people are really looking for them these days where they perhaps weren't so before. So we've been pleasantly surprised that where we brought this to our clients' attention, they are willing to change. And I think you will see from, you know, the two buildings that Juan has shown you and the one that I just showed you the little movie of, those clients were very, very interested in how they reduce carbon and how they have healthier buildings. And it was an absolute core to the design approach.
Yes, and to add to that, there's quite a lot of research now, and I think all the major tech companies which are leading the transformation of the workplace already understood this, is that healthy people and happy people work better and are more creative than people who are bored and unhappy. And the environment in which you work has a lot of influence on your well-being. So if you create healthy, happy environments, people will be more productive and will give you better results. So there is this understanding in the workplace now that you have to have natural daylight, natural ventilation, high ceilings, outdoor spaces, because if the people who work for you are happy to go to work and feel comfortable, they will be more creative. So there's studies that relate productivity to the quality of your air, to the quality of your lighting, and they all show that this can be validated empirically.
I think also, just to supplement that, many employees looking to work in the types of buildings that we've shown you, and also to live in the places and spaces that they won't go and work for employees who don't have some form of social conscience, as well as to give them healthy places. So these really are necessary. If you want to attract the best people, you need buildings of this nature in the first place. Otherwise, they go somewhere else for a job.
Especially the X, Y, and Z generation, Katya, people of your age. They're very bossy, they're very demanding, and they want good quality workplace, or they'll work somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Now, we have a few questions from our audience. Some of are in Spanish, some of are in English. How do you want them to?
Well, that's whatever you prefer. I can answer in Spanish or in English. So,
okay. Well, the first one says, I'm going to do it in Spanish, I'm sorry.
Okay.
¿Cuáles han sido los mayores retos en sus proyectos en América Latina y cómo ha influido la cultura en los mismos?
Bueno, creo que son iguales los retos en todo el mundo, no creo que en América Latina sean diferentes. Creo que los retos son los mismos en todas partes. Acá tenemos una expresión que se dice, los clientes quieren la chancha y los 20. Los clientes quieren todo, ellos quieren el edificio más sustentable, más vendible, la mejor marca, pero a la vez que sea el edificio más barato. Y que le cobres el honorario más barato o que le des tus servicios gratis. Entonces, una de las cosas más difíciles, quizás aquí en Sudamérica, es que culturalmente los arquitectos en Sudamérica estamos un poco adoctrinados a que tenemos que regalar nuestro trabajo. Tenemos que trabajar gratis, tenemos que trabajar al costo, casi sin ningún beneficio. Entonces, eso ha sido una lucha particular quizás de Sudamérica, de decir, bueno, si no podemos defender lo que nuestro trabajo vale, no podemos trabajar. Perdemos muchos proyectos por el nivel de nuestro honorario, que es alto, pero nuestra valorización también es altísima para los clientes. Así que ese es uno de los desafíos más grandes de América. Es igual no solo para Foster & Partners, sino para todos los arquitectos. Y eso creo que es importante que los colegios profesionales mantengan la conciencia de toda la matrícula de que tenemos que trabajar como un equipo para comunicarle a nuestros clientes que nuestro trabajo es muy valioso, que agregamos valor. Nuestro trabajo no es valorado, no podemos trabajar. Tenemos que usarnos otra vez. Yo invito a toda la matrícula que hablemos con nuestros colegios profesionales para establecer cuáles son los horarios mínimos y justos de los cuales el trabajo del arquitecto tiene que ser respetado y valorado. La segunda parte son los costos de construcción, que obviamente en todo el mundo, pero particularmente en Latinoamérica, para hacer edificios lo más baratos posibles en su construcción. Pero bueno, un edificio no es de calidad si no está bien construido, no hay una buena dirección de obra, y todos los profesionales de las especialidades no son los mejores profesionales. Entonces, el otro desafío, que tampoco podemos construir edificios bien si no se entiende que el edificio y el costo de un edificio sustentable tienen un costo mínimo que tiene que ser respetado, sino la calidad del edificio, la calidad de los espacios es obviamente perjudicada.
Super, muchas gracias. We have a next question that says, what trends do you anticipate in terms of sustainability for building?
Chris?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the beginning of that. Was it what trends?
What trends?
Yeah. Well, I think we've shown that materials have to be looked at in a different way to the way that they have been in the past. And one of the things that we've realized is if you think about the whole life of a building, these days the atmospheric impact, the carbon impact, can quite easily be 3/4 to do with the materials in the building not the energy that's consumed by the building. And that's because mostly throughout the world, energy grids are becoming cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. So the balance changes. So we have to think a lot more about what we make buildings of than we did before. And that changes two things. It changes the design to make sure you minimize the amount of material. So on the examples that Juan showed in Cordoba, for example, we were very careful to keep the spans of the structure down as small as sensible for the type of building to reduce the weight of the building and the amount of material. So we see that is definitely the case. And then, as you will see in La Fabrica, in addition to that, then I think the idea is to find better materials, smarter materials. So timber is one, but heavily recycled steel is another, and also concrete with either no cement or low amounts of cement is happening and is coming along much more. So we think the actual material palette and the material choices will inform the sustainability mission, together with, as you'll have seen from Juan's buildings, making the buildings much more natural, connecting people to nature so as they are happier and more healthy. So I think those are the two big drivers: connecting buildings to nature and what do you make buildings out of.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for this presentation. But thank you so much to the both of you for joining us. It was very interesting, and as I said in the beginning, it was an honor to have you both with us here today. So thank you so much. Now we are going to send it up with Pamela Catalan, who is our CEO, to close the whole event. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you to you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Chris and Juan, on behalf of Guatemala Green Building Council and América Sostenible. Thank you very much for sharing your time and experience in this space. Gracias a todos. Hemos llegado al final de nuestro evento, América Sostenible. La verdad que han sido 3 días de mucho aprendizaje, de mucho compartir. Definitivamente es una conversación que sigue, es una conversación que pusimos sobre la mesa a través de este espacio, de esta plataforma virtual que nos permitió tener a gente de toda América, y la verdad nos sentimos muy honrados, muy agradecidos en nombre del Guatemala Green Building Council, de la Junta Directiva, de la Embajada de Canadá, del Comité Organizador de América Sostenible. Muchísimas gracias por haber apartado el tiempo de seguir capacitándonos y seguir creando estas alianzas. El objetivo de desarrollo sostenible número 17, que es mi favorito y siempre lo menciono, necesitamos crear alianzas, necesitamos trabajar en conjunto. Tenemos una meta muy clara que es la descarbonización de las edificaciones. Como sector tenemos un llamado urgente a la acción, ¿verdad? Somos el sector que tenemos el mayor potencial para poder revertir la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero y en consecuencia del cambio climático. Así que sigamos trabajando juntos. Esto apenas empieza. En nombre de todos los Green Building Councils, les invitamos a acercarse a nosotros, a entablar estos puentes y seguir trabajando por una verdadera América sostenible. Gracias a todos, nos seguimos viendo y nos vemos en el 2021 para América Sostenible. Feliz día para todos.